Here we go. We're live. This is what I was worried about. Started before I even got out the door. That's why I didn't do it last week. I was hacking way too much. Anyways, I want to welcome you here to Prog Monster. My name is Murph. I am the host of this show. This is a show that is dedicated to progressive rock and other forms of rock music. So tonight we're going to be doing an episode of Into the Progverse. This is kind of a live stream that I've taken up doing. It wasn't really a planned thing, but I've taken up doing this every Friday. I did miss last Friday because I could barely breathe and I was hacking everywhere. I think I've actually missed a couple weeks now, haven't I? Maybe. I'm not sure. Anyways, I decided to pick on a topic that I think I've done a little bit of this before, but we're going to do a little bit more of it. So I've picked out the 5 albums that I think, generally speaking, have had a huge impact on prog music. Otherwise, I would not have a channel, would I? So I'm going to go through these. It looks like I'm going to go through them chronologically. That makes sense. Well, maybe not quite chronologically, but close enough. So I'm going to talk about these albums and as they pertain to affecting prog music as a whole and having impacts on prog music and maybe starting something off and going forth. So a couple of these albums I don't think are necessarily prog albums. I don't even think the first one I don't think is even a proto-prog album. I think these are just albums that led to progressive rock. They basically opened the door for the thoughts that some bands were having about doing this and that, and then they heard these particular bands do this, and it opened the door for them to just go off in all directions. And one of those directions led to prog music, right? That's just my opinion based on my observations over 4 years I've had this channel, or 3.5 now, and my interest in rock music over my lifetime, and listening to other people's opinions and reading stuff and all that kind of stuff that goes with that. Revelation. So I'm going to start. I'm not going to be on here for very long. I hope that if people join me, that it is okay with you. I don't think I'm going to be able to get through this without having a coughing fit at some point, and I only have so much water, right? So the first album we're going to talk about is from this band, the Beatles. And everybody who knows that the Beatles produced this album, that this album has had generally a fantastic and very significant impact on prog music, because this is kind of the first move towards prog music, a psychedelic album. But not just a psychedelic album with a concept to it. So to me, this is kind of this is not a prog album. I don't think. It does have some prog elements to it. The conceptual part and some of the use of the songs and tying them all together is nice inside cover. I always like this. But this kind of opened the door to different styles of music, because up until probably this album, a lot of bands were just kind of playing rock and roll music. That's where, in those days, they called it rock and roll music. It's stuff that started in the 50s and continued into the 60s. So rock and roll music probably, I don't know when it officially started. I guess there's probably no official time period, but I would say 1955. And by the time this album came out in 1967, it had been around about 12 years, right? Most people thought of rock and roll music as being about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and love was in there as well. And, basically that's the way people did it, when the way people thought about it. This album is very different. This album, they start going off into the use of drugs and writing kind of the psychedelic flair to the music and having a topic in their not just in one particular song, but in the entire length of the album. So it's a story, right? And a lot of people believe that this was kind of the beginning of that. A lot of people hated it. They think this album kind of destroyed rock and roll. Other people think this allowed for an explosion of music in all directions. I tend to be of the second mindset because my rock and roll music doesn't really always include sex, drugs, and rock and roll and those love themes and that kind of stuff. I like stuff to be a little bit more story-ish, I guess, if that makes any sense. So for me, the Beatles and their Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band is kind of the beginning of that explosion to heavy metal, to progressive rock, to dance music even, all the different genres that burst forth, I think kind of was initiated by this album. So that's the first of the 5 albums. The next one up, not going to be really much of a surprise. Again, I don't think this is a prog album. It does have a lot of conceptual parts to it. It is a concept album. This one tells a story that's easy to follow if you know what the story is about. The other one, maybe not so easy to tell, but this one definitely, Tommy from The Who, not a prog album, I don't think. Some people might call it one. I'm not going to argue if they do. I could see why they might come to that conclusion. But this is basically a story of a boy who's deaf and dumb, and his life, I guess his life story, and his coming out of that. People use the word genius a lot. Just about everybody's a genius in rock music. I find that kind of funny, though, to be honest. The word genius to me is overused. People use it for everything. Oh, that guy's a genius on the guitar. Jimi Hendrix was a genius on the guitar. Well, what I think Jimi Hendrix was extremely gifted with the guitar. The genius part, maybe that was the way in which he used the music, possibly. But I'm not sold on that. I'm not saying that it's wrong. Some people believe that. That's their choice. I don't necessarily buy that. Now, in the case of Pete Townsend, I think he is one of the geniuses of the rock music. He's the one that put this all together. This is a concept out of his own mind, telling a story. And at that time, nobody had done this. Well, maybe the guy from the Kinks might have done it with Arthur, but for some reason, this one had a huger impact and is much more well-known. I didn't know about the Arthur one until many years later. But Tommy, I knew right away, right? Is Pete Townsend a genius? I would say he is. He wrote all the lyrics. He came up with the musical concept. He put this whole idea together. So he took a bunch of stuff and brought it all together to make this masterpiece. I think he's a genius. So that's just my opinion. Take it for whatever it's worth. It might not be worth very much, actually. Some of the songs I like, but this album doesn't feel like separate songs. It feels like one long song. More than any other album, or one of the things that I think makes prog albums is they tell a story from the beginning to the end. Maybe it's not always the same story. Maybe it's different pieces. In the case of this one, it's one story from the beginning to end. So it does have some prog elements to it. But I would still say this is a rock opera more than anything else. Not really even psychedelic, although there is a little bit of a psychedelic feel to the album. the cover definitely has that little feel to it, and there's some different songs in here. Pieces of this album can be taken out and played as individual songs, but I think you get a more overall feel for it if you play the whole thing from beginning to end. That's the way I always play this album. And for me, it's a story, and that story is a concept, and that concept was put together by one person. So I think he's a genius. The only other person that I really think is a genius in rock that I don't really have any arguments with is Frank Zappa. This is a guy that can play so many different things and can take all different pieces of music and put it in and make one solid album. And he could do all kinds of different things. To me, he is what I would call a genius. The rest of these people that they say is a genius, Michael Jackson was a genius because he invented all of these dance moves. For me, there's a line that's drawn between being a gifted person who has a gifted ability and being a genius. I don't know if Michael Jackson qualifies as a genius. I've had arguments with people about whether he would qualify or not. But one thing you can't take away from him is that he was very gifted, and I think the same applies here. But I just think Pete Townshend's a genius, and I think Frank Zappa's probably a genius too. So we're going to move on to the next album in my set here, which is probably the first real serious progressive rock album. To me, this is the birth of progressive rock here. And we all know which album I'm going to be putting up here. King Crimson's In the Court of the Crimson King. Definitely very progressive. All the elements that you want in a progressive. The only thing about this album is I don't think of it as a concept album. Some of the songs are kind of conceptual individually. Like Moonchild has a couple of suites. Epitaph has a couple of suites. In the Court of the Crimson King also has a couple of suites. So you have these kind of, and even the 21st Century Schizoid Man with its mirror part. So you got these little bit conceptual parts throughout the album, but the songs are all different. But this is the beginning for me of progressive rock. You've got all kinds of different instrumentation here. You've got all kinds of different conceptual stuff going on. It's not a sex, drugs, and rock and roll album. The cover is very progressive in nature. The music is unlike anything that anybody had heard at this point in time. It's also very hard to absorb. It took a long time for me to get to that point. And for me, that's one of the things that signifies a progressive rock album. Is it takes a long time to absorb the music and get into it. Yeah. So this, I think, is a masterpiece album in very many. It's not, and it hasn't reached the masterpiece status for me yet, but I think it ultimately is a gimme. It's going to be a masterpiece album. Is it King Crimson's greatest album? At this point, it's my favorite of the ones I've listened to. I'm now getting into the 6th studio album soon. And so perhaps by the time I've done all 12 of their studio albums, I may have a different viewpoint as to where this one ranks in that grouping. But for now, I think, two things here. I think it's a fantastic album, maybe their best, and it's the beginning of prog or progressive rock. That's the third album. The next two albums aren't necessarily well, yeah, I would have to say they're both impactful, but in a different kind of way. So we'll get on to them. The next one up I'm going to talk about is this one, even though the other one came before it. We'll talk about this one first. Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. So by this time, progressive rock was raging all across the place. Many progressive rock albums. This one may be the accumulation or the coming together of everything that Pink Floyd would into a masterpiece album. Some people would say this is a work of a genius. I'm sorry, it's hard for me to think of Roger Waters as a genius. I think he's a bit of a loony, but he did write the lyrical parts of this, but he wasn't alone in the production of this album. I think the other guys had a fair amount of impact here as well. The thing that I think is very amazing about this, and I should call it what it is, Dark Side of the Moon. This is Pink Floyd's 8th album. I'm not really telling anybody, people, stuff that they don't know, because this album has been around now for more than 50 years. Everybody who knows anything about Pink Floyd knows that this is one of the greatest albums of all time. And it's viewed as one of the greatest. It's the longest, or one of the longest standing albums, I believe, on the Billboard Top 200 or whatever it is. The thing about this album, though, that I find to be incredible is it's all the songs are tied together. Each song builds to a certain point and then gradually goes into the next song. And I find that throughout the entire album. And they use a lot of sound effects to create that. So they want to go from one song to the next, and they use some kind of sound effect to make that transition. And they do that almost everywhere on this particular album. It's just really a very well thought out and well orchestrated album, going from point A to point B to point C in a seamless fashion, tying everything together perfectly. It'd be difficult to find anything to say negative about this. Like you couldn't take any part of this and say, well, that's a mistake. It's just not a word that goes with this album. That's why I think it has to be an album that has to be considered on this list. Just everything about it, you've taken all these parts. This to me is representative. All these parts of a rainbow, and if you go backwards, they all go together seamlessly into a white light. Or if you go the other way, they break apart into a rainbow, right? It's just amazing how not only physically but symbolically this album is just next to perfection in just about every way you can think of. And it wouldn't be, you could do all that and say all those things, but it wouldn't be much of an album if it didn't sound very good. But then it has all that too. Like all the songs are amazing. This is an album that should be sat down and listened to at a fairly high volume and just listen to each of the effects. It's almost a spiritual experience, this album, in very many ways. I think it's one of the greatest progressive rock albums that's been ever made. And I would find it hard to believe that anybody could match it. However, I think there is one album that did and exceeded it. So that's it for the number 4 album on this list. And they're not in any. I'm just trying to put them together as I'm telling this kind of story that I think makes perfect sense. So the last album is, to me, the greatest of all progressive rock albums. Not because it was the first one, or because it was put together in such a perfect fashion, or that it tells a perfect story from beginning to beginning, or that it was it was the first of a type of album that led to so many. But I think in many ways it is a first of a type of album in many ways. We're talking about Close to the Edge from Yes, of course. I think this is the near perfect album in many ways. So you've only got 3 tracks on here, and each of them has, actually the first 2 tracks, 1 and 2, have suites, and then the final track does not have a suite, but there's no weakness on this album anywhere. There's no bad parts to this album anywhere. Each of the songs is a work of art in its own play, and it's just an album that you can't listen to and not hear something new all the time. Some people don't really like the cover. They say it's kind of boring for John, and that they would have preferred them to use the centerfold. This would have been a much more brilliant and accessible type of album cover, but I like this cover. It's different. It's almost like almost reminds me of the Hulk, that gamma radiation bomb going off at the bottom, but it's a little bit different. And green is one of those colors I like. So the first thing about this album that became noticeable to me is just how good the instrumentation on is. I don't think there's a better overall instrumentated album. Maybe Relayer might be better. I don't know. But this is perfect. You've got some of the best musicians at their instruments. Steve Howe on guitar and Chris Squire on bass, Bill Bruford on drums, Rick Wakeman on keyboards and synthesizers, and maybe one of the most legendary vocalists in John Anderson, a guy who still sounds the same 50 years later. Unbelievable. Is this a masterpiece? Absolutely. Is this a work of genius? No, I don't think it's a work of genius. I think it's a work of a lot of talent, a lot of effort, and a lot of thought. And I think they've taken bits and pieces here of different songs and sewn them together to make this masterpiece. I love this album. It's my third favorite album of all time. Probably my favorite prog album of all time. There's so much you could say about this. You could talk for an hour just about this album alone. The opening track, Close to the Edge, has everything that you want in that epic. It has build up. It has all kinds of quirky instrumentation. It has smooth transitions from one section to another. It's got a legendary keyboard part to it. It's got some fantastic vocals on it. The drumming is really technically sound and fantastic. So it's a near perfect song. And You and I is not much further off of that. It's a little bit more vocally understandable. Like the story is easier to follow. And You and I, it's easier to maybe a quieter listen to. Fantastic tune though. And then you've got the hardest track on the album, which is Siberian Katru. This is just all pure, great instrumentation, like from start to end. And all three songs are fairly lengthy too. So yeah, it's an album without weaknesses to me, and that's why I think it is maybe the greatest prog album ever. And I think so many bands look at this album and think, how can we do something that great? How can we do it? So it's an inspirational album for a lot of these people too. I think it's just a masterpiece album. So there you go. Those are the 5 albums that I think. What did I call the title of this again? My 5 most important prog albums. Yeah, I don't even know. Maybe that wasn't a very good title. I initially put it down with a certain idea, and then I decided that I wanted to go a little bit further. So I don't know that the first 2 albums are necessarily prog albums, but I'm almost 100% certain that they had a huge impact on the prog scene as they did, especially that first one, the Beatles one. I think that really kind of opened the door for a lot of bands to go in whatever direction they wanted, because they said, well, the Beatles did it and everybody liked it. And it opened the mind of people like, let's just do what we want to do, right? I know when it first came out, Pink Floyd were driving and they all pulled over to the side of the road to listen to this album and were like amazed by it, right? So maybe that contributed a lot to this album. The Dark Side of the Moon. Hard to say, right? So I'll just tell you the 5 albums again. So we started out by talking about Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band from the Beatles, 1967 release. Tommy from The Who, 1969 release. Also from the same year, King Crimson's In the Court of the Crimson King, their debut album from 1969. Probably should have done this one next, but we didn't. This from 1972, Close to the Edge. Yes, maybe the greatest prog album of all time, or progressive album of all time. And then Dark Side of the Moon from Pink Floyd. This may be the closest to a perfect album ever recorded, in my opinion. Anyways, that's all I got to say tonight. I think that personally, myself, I think this is the reason why progressive rock is the genre that I choose to be my favorite genre, because it's always, when you talk about albums that are, some people will say, oh, that's just a copy of this band, or that's just a copy of that band, or progressive rock isn't really exist anymore. It's just prog rock now, which is a different kind of phrase. They kind of put them differently. So progressive rock is always advancing, and prog rock is sounding like progressive rock. But anytime you're putting together anything that's complex, has a story behind it, is great to listen to, and everybody's instrumentation is fantastic, I think that advances music. And that's the reason why I like progressive rock, because it advances music. You know, AC/DC, who I like a lot, they're one of my favorite bands. They have a formula. BTO, they have a formula. Band I like quite a bit. They have a formula. You know, they make music that sounds a certain way. Yes, it's catchy as hell, and I love to play them over and over again. But I don't think it advances music. I think it just replays the greatness of music. So that's just my own opinion. Anyways, I'm starting to feel like my throat might break down to a non-existent frog sound. And we don't want me sounding like Kermit the Frog or Yoda. So perhaps it's time for me to end it a bit early this week. I think I'll try next week a game, but maybe go a little bit longer. It's distracting when your voice doesn't work the way you want it. Anyways, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I tried to give my own opinions as best I can. I'm still a novice at this thing, so maybe my opinions don't mean a hill of beans. But we all have our own opinions about how this thing worked out. Maybe I don't quite have the science down to an exact thing, but it's just my perception of what I've seen over the years. That's all it is. Anyways, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Into the Progverse, a live stream that I do here every Friday. Hopefully we'll see you back next week for another episode. Please hit the like, subscribe, and notification bell. That helps my channel a lot. And if you want to make any comments about any of the things I've said, or, give me your opinion about certain albums, or what you think, or maybe you want to add some album in there that you think is more influential, or maybe has more impact, or maybe you think it's the perfect or the best of all time, you could do that as well. Anyways, take care. Have yourself a good night, and we will be back next Friday with another live stream. So, bye.